If I told you to picture the most eco-friendly, green, low-carbon nation on Earth, what exactly do you see?
You were probably picturing, like, wind farms spinning off the coast of Denmark.
Right. Exactly. Or
hmm
maybe massive, I don't know, sleek solar arrays stretching across a desert in California or something.
Yeah, we definitely have this ingrained image of what it means to be a quote-unquote responsible global citizen right now, especially in the era of the climate crisis.
We do. We totally expect green innovation to look highly developed, wealthy, and, technologically advanced. You picture electric buses, high-speed rail, suburban homes, completely off the grid.
Right, because we have spent decades being conditioned to associate a low ecological footprint with these massive engineering triumphs.
Right.
We just assume that the countries leaving the smallest mark on the planet are the ones that have, well, successfully innovated their way out of the fossil fuel trap. It is a very comfortable, very Western assumption, I mean.
But then you step out of that theoretical bubble and you look at the real world of global data. And that assumption doesn't just crack, it completely shatters.
Oh, absolutely shatters.
So today we are inviting you to join us on a deep dive into the source material. We are looking at a really comprehensive 30-year, multidimensional data report spanning from 1990 all the way to 2023.
And it is dense.
It is super dense. We are looking at a sweeping, granular analysis of Liberia and its place in global human development. And the data we have here presents us with what might be the ultimate global paradox.
It really is a paradox.
What if the numbers prove that one of the most low-carbon, eco-friendly nations on Earth isn't some green utopia, but a country trapped in an absolute developmental nightmare?
Right, and the mission of this deep dive is to tear apart that exact paradox. We are unpacking a 30-year data array that contains literally millions of data points across health, education, the macroeconomic landscape, and gender equality. And our goal is to figure out what it actually looks like when human progress is traded for a smaller carbon footprint. We are going to examine the literal, on-the-ground human costs of leaving almost no mark on the planet.
And conversely, we have to ask what the rest of the industrialized world can learn from Liberia's incredible, albeit deeply painful, resilience over the last 3 decades.
Exactly.
I want to set the tone for you right out of the gate here. This isn't about us just, reading spreadsheets into a microphone.
No, definitely not.
This is about discovering the brutal, inspiring, and really complicated human stories hidden inside these sweeping metrics. We are looking at what it means to survive a total societal collapse, to try and rebuild, and to attempt to thrive when the global odds are entirely stacked against you.
Right.
So I want to start with that ultimate paradox from the very first page of the report. The idea that a microscopic carbon footprint is actually a screaming distress signal.
Okay, let's look at the stark visual contrast the report hits us with immediately on page 1. On one side, we have the global average for per capita carbon emissions. Across the world, the average person is responsible for emitting about 4.54 tons of carbon every single year.
Okay, 4.54 tons. That is a massive volume of invisible gas when you really try to, visualize it in physical space.
It is huge.
That number represents our entire modern existence. That is our cars, our air conditioning, our flights, our global supply chains, delivering packages to our doors within 2 days. It is literally the exhaust pipe of the modern standard of living.
Right. And then on the other side of that visual, we have Liberia. In Liberia, the per capita carbon emission is a microscopic 0.14 tons.
Wait. 0.14 tons compared to 4.54 tons.
Yep.
That is not just a gap. That is a completely different universe. That is practically a rounding error on the global scale.
It is less than a fraction of a fraction, honestly. But to truly understand the gravity of that 0.14 tons, we have to look at a relatively new metric introduced in the data. It is the PHDI.
That's PHDI.
Right. That stands for the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
Okay, let's slow down and pull that apart for a second.
Sure.
I know the standard Human Development Index, the HDI. It measures a country's health, education, and standard of living. It's like the ultimate report card for a nation. But what does planetary pressures adjusted actually do to the math?
It is a brilliant and, frankly, incredibly sobering recalibration. The PHDI takes a country's traditional human development score and effectively penalizes it for the environmental damage the country causes to achieve that development.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It looks at carbon dioxide emissions and the material footprint, which is the sheer tonnage of raw materials extracted from the earth to fuel the economy. When you apply this adjustment globally, the world's average human development score drops by a staggering 10.05%.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, the world is heavily taxing the planet to achieve its current standard of living. The PHDI reveals that hidden ecological cost. We are essentially losing 10% of our supposed progress when we finally factor in the catastrophic damage we do to the Earth to get it.
That is the global reality, yes. But here's where the data reveals the paradox of Liberia. When you apply that exact same planetary pressure adjustment to Liberia's human development score, their score only drops by 0.9%.
Less than 1%.
Less than 1%.
I mean, I have to push back on this, or at least play devil's advocate for a second. Looking at the terrifying realities of the climate crisis, part of me wants to look at that 0.9% drop and say, well, good for them.
Right, I get that.
From a purely ecological standpoint, they are living perfectly within the boundaries of the planet. They aren't contributing to the melting of the ice caps or the rising sea levels. Isn't a low-impact society the ultimate goal we are all supposedly striving for right now?
I understand the impulse to romanticize it. I really do. But you have to look at what living within the boundaries actually looks like on the ground for a Liberian citizen. This isn't a choice they made. This lack of an ecological footprint isn't born from progressive policy or green innovation. They aren't running entirely on next-generation solar grids or building cities out of sustainable carbon-negative materials.
Okay, so what is it then?
This 0.14-ton carbon footprint is a direct, inescapable byproduct of extreme systemic poverty and a total lack of modern industrialization.
Oh, wow. So they aren't emitting carbon because they simply don't have the factories, the power plants, the heavy infrastructure, or the consumer economy that generates those emissions.
Exactly.
They aren't driving electric cars, they are just walking.
Yeah, they're walking. The core pain point highlighted by this report is a deeply uncomfortable question that challenges the entire global environmental movement, really. Are we inadvertently equating developmental stagnation with ecological breathing room?
That is heavy.
The data forces us to confront the ugly fact that the only reason Liberia isn't stressing the planet is because its people are struggling just to survive on it.
That is a staggering realization. I want you, the listener, to just pause for a second and reflect on your own carbon footprint today. Think about what you did from the moment you woke up.
Right, just the basics.
You probably woke up in a temperature-controlled room. You turned on a light switch without even looking at it.
Yeah.
You opened a refrigerator powered by a massive centralized energy grid. You maybe drove a car, took a train, or even just used your smartphone to stream this audio over a network of massive data centers.
Yep.
All of those things, the invisible scaffolding of a decent modern life, are what constitute that 4.54-ton global average. Liberia's lack of a footprint means an absolute absence of all those fundamental modern safety nets.
To understand exactly why that footprint is so small and why that poverty is so entrenched, we cannot just look at the carbon data. We have to look at the baseline human development over the last 30 years. We need to move to the core metric of the report, the unadjusted human development index from 1990 to 2023.
Before we get swallowed by the numbers, let's establish exactly how this metric works. If the HDI is the ultimate report card, what are the specific subjects being graded?
Okay, so it is a composite score made up of 3 critical dimensions of human life. First is a long and healthy life, measured strictly by life expectancy at birth.
Okay, health, got it.
Second is access to knowledge, measured by expected years of schooling for children entering the system, alongside the mean years of schooling for adults.
So education.
Right. And third is a decent standard of living, measured by gross national income per capita. The final score is a number between 0 and 1. The closer you are to 1, the higher the human development.
Looking at the 30-year timeline from the source material, the global trend is actually quite encouraging, at least on the surface. The world has seen a steady, almost relentless climb. In 1990, the global HDI was at 0.60. By 2023, it had climbed to 0.756.
And that climb represents billions of people gaining access to antibiotics, better sanitation, expanded public education, and entry into the global economy. It is a triumph of modern development.
But Liberia's path on this chart is drastically, heartbreakingly different. We don't even have reliable data for them for much of the 1990s because the state essentially collapsed during the devastating Civil War.
Right, the data just goes dark.
But in 1999, they emerge in the data at a staggering low of 0.403. And over the next 2.5 decades, They slowly, painfully crawled to 0.510 by 2023.
Yeah, that 0.510 places Liberia at 177 out of 193 countries globally. They remain firmly in the bottom tier of human development.
Wow, 177 out of 193.
And if you look closely at the global line versus the Liberian line, you see something fascinating about resilience. The report highlights a rare consecutive global HDI dip in 2020 and 2021, where the global average dropped from 0.745 down to 0.742.
Ah, that is the COVID-19 pandemic leaving a permanent scar on the data.
Exactly. The pandemic caused life expectancy to drop globally. It shuttered schools and disrupted supply chains everywhere. It is a powerful reminder that global progress isn't a law of physics, you know? It can be reversed.
Right.
But when the developed world takes a hit, it generally has the institutional infrastructure to bounce back, which is exactly what we see with the global recovery in 2022 and 2023. Liberia, however, has spent 30 years trying to bounce back from a much deeper, vastly more destructive localized collapse.
I look at these two lines on the graph. The global HDI line is like a massive, steady escalator. You step on in 1990, and even if the power cuts out for a second during a global pandemic, the machinery eventually kicks back in and keeps carrying you upward.
That is a great way to picture it.
You have the momentum of the entire world behind you. But Liberia's line, that is like watching someone free climb a steep, crumbling cliff face in the dark. Every single inch upward requires a massive expenditure of energy, and the risk of a fatal backward fall is always there.
And to understand what causes an HDI score to start at the bottom of that cliff, we have to isolate the first dimension of the index, which is health. What actually causes an entire nation's development score to plummet to 0.403? The answer lies in the life expectancy data on page 4, and it is grim.
This is where the numbers stop being abstract statistical points and become viscerally shocking.
The report reveals that in 1990, life expectancy in Liberia plummeted to an almost unimaginable 37.6 years.
37.6 years. I mean, wow. Imagine your own neighborhood, your own family tree, if nobody lived past 37.
It's hard to even fathom.
We aren't talking about a specific high-risk demographic, like soldiers on a front line. We are talking about the national average for every human being born in the country at that time. 37 is not middle age. 37 means an entire generation is systematically erased from the timeline.
It reflects the absolute, total devastation of the Civil War. And the mechanism of that lowered life expectancy is crucial to understand. It wasn't just battlefield casualties driving the number down.
What else was it?
When a conflict of that magnitude occurs, the entire physical and social infrastructure that keeps humans alive collapses. Hospitals are shelled. The supply chains for basic medicines like antibiotics or malaria pills, they simply vanish.
Right, so disease is just spread.
Exactly. Water sanitation plants stop running, meaning preventable diseases like cholera run rampant. It is the complete breakdown of the complex systems that allow human beings to survive past their prime physical youth.
Think about the psychological and sociological residue of that. If the average person isn't living past 40, who is passing down the skills, who is maintaining the institutional memory of how the government works, or how the schools are run, or even how the farms are traditionally managed,
You lose everything.
you are left with a nation of the very young trying to navigate a destroyed, traumatized landscape without the guidance of a preceding generation. You lose the mentors. You lose the seasoned leaders. The concept of a grandparent essentially ceases to exist in large parts of the country.
And that loss of institutional and cultural memory is one of the most profound, unquantifiable tragedies of a severely depressed life expectancy. You have to rebuild the knowledge base from scratch.
Yeah.
But the data that follows that 1990 collapse is perhaps the most inspiring part of the entire report. We see what is effectively framed as a miracle recovery. Despite that absolute nadir in 1990, by 2023, Liberia's life expectancy rebounded to 62.1 years.
A 65% increase in a single generation. It shows that when the shooting stops, when the violence ends, and basic systems are even partially restored, the human drive to survive, to rebuild, and to nurture the next generation is incredibly powerful.
It is a phenomenal achievement in public health and post-conflict peacebuilding. However, we have to temper that awe with the global reality presented in the comparison tables.
Right. Context is everything.
While a 65% increase is miraculous for Liberia, that 62.16 years is still 11 full years behind the 2023 global average of 73.3 years.
So they have performed a generational miracle. They have moved mountains just to get back to a point where they are still more than a decade behind the rest of the world.
They have climbed out of the abyss, but they are still nowhere near the summit. And that missing decade of life expectancy, those 11 years, has massive economic and social ramifications.
I can imagine.
If your population is still dying a decade earlier than the global average, you are losing a decade of their peak economic output and their accumulated wisdom. Which brings us perfectly to the second dimension of human development on page 5, education.
Because if you manage to survive past childhood, if public health improves enough that you expect to live into your 60s, the very next step in human development is building a mind. You have to learn. But as the report shows us, having the desire for an education and actually receiving one are two very different realities.
To understand the education chasm, we have to break down how the HDI measures it. It doesn't just look at one number. It uses two distinct metrics to capture the tension between what a country wants and what it actually achieves.
And what are they?
The first is expected years of schooling, or EYS. This measures aspiration. It is the number of years of education a child entering the school system can expect to receive, assuming current enrollment rates stay constant.
It's the promise the society makes to the child.
Exactly. And the second metric is mean years of schooling, or MYS. This is the reality check. It measures the average number of years of education actually received by people ages 25 and older.
Let's look at the global numbers first to establish a baseline. The global average for expected years of schooling is 13.04 years. That covers kindergarten, primary school, secondary school, and maybe a touch of college or vocational training.
Yep.
And the global mean, the reality for adults right now, is 8.7 years. So globally, we aspired to 13 years, and we are currently living at almost 9.
Now look at the data for Liberia. Liberia expects 10.47 years of schooling for its children. But the mean, the actual achievement of the adult population, is a heartbreaking 6.17 years.
6.17 actual years of school. That means the average adult in Liberia has essentially a 6th grade education. They are barely acquiring foundational literacy and numeracy before their education stops forever.
But the truly poignant part of this data is hitting in the historical timeline. If you look back to the year 2000, right in that incredibly fragile, violent window between the civil wars, Liberia's expected years of schooling actually hit a high of 10.4 years.
Wait, so almost a quarter century ago, in the middle of severe national instability, they were projecting the exact same educational aspiration they have today.
Yes. And what that specific data point proves is that the desire to learn was fiercely present post-war. The families desperately wanted their children in school. The children wanted to be there. The ambition was undeniably there, but the infrastructure completely failed them over the long term.
I want to use an analogy here. It's like a community has the ambition, the initial funding, and the blueprints to build a 10-story building. They poured the foundation, they start laying the bricks, everyone is working together.
Right.
But then the national supply chain completely collapses. The cement stops arriving, the steel is diverted elsewhere, and you run out of materials right after you finish the 6th floor. The intent to build a skyscraper was genuine. The systemic resources to finish it simply were not there.
Oh, we have to ask the mechanical question. What forces a child out of school at year 6? Why does the building stop at the 6th floor?
It has to be economic pressure. If an entire nation is averaging a 6th grade education, they aren't leaving school because they've mastered the curriculum and decided they are finished learning. They are leaving because they have no other choice. They have to survive.
It is a combination of intense economic pressure on the family unit, a sheer lack of physical infrastructure, and a lack of qualified teachers. If you live in a rural area, there might literally not be a secondary school within walking distance.
Yeah, literally no school to go to.
Exactly. But even if there is, when a family is struggling with extreme multidimensional poverty, a child sitting in a classroom is a child who is not earning income or helping secure food for the day. The long-term, abstract investment of education simply cannot compete with the immediate, brutal necessity of daily survival.
If a child is pulled out of school in the 6th grade to help the family survive, that child is almost certainly never going to enter the formal high-wage economy. They are locked into subsistence farming or informal street labor, which means the national wealth never grows.
It stunts everything.
When an entire generation is forced to leave school early, the macroeconomic impact down the line is devastating. This brings us to the third dimension of the HDI on page 6, the economic reality.
We measure this through gross national income, or GNI, per capita. And the report adjusts this to 2021 purchasing power parity dollars.
What does that actually mean?
That is a highly technical way of saying it accounts for the local cost of living and inflation, making the numbers truly comparable across different global economies. It tells us what the money can actually buy.
Listeners, brace yourselves for these numbers, because they are hard to wrap your head around. The global average GNI per capita in 2023 is $20,327. For Liberia, in 2023, the GNI per capita is $1,537.
Let that disparity sit for a moment.
We aren't just saying Liberia is poorer. We are looking at a 13.2x difference between the wealth generated by a global average citizen and a Liberian citizen. The average human being on this planet has 13 times the economic power, 13 times the resources of someone living in Liberia.
And again, to understand the depth of the historical trauma they're trying to climb out of, we must look at the data from the 1990s. During the worst of the crisis, around 1995, Liberia's economic output was essentially at a freezing point. The GNI per capita was just $507.
$507 for an entire year.
Yes.
Try to imagine how an economy even functions on $507 a year. That is a shattered state. That is an economy where currency has almost ceased to function in a modern, abstract sense.
It is an economy operating purely on subsistence, agriculture, scavenging, and localized bartering. There is no surplus. And while growing from $507 in 1995 to $1,537 today shows undeniable hard-fought progress, it perfectly illustrates the compounding nature of poverty.
Wealth compounds, but poverty compounds just as aggressively. If your national income is a 13th of the global average, that reality dictates every single policy decision a government can make.
Absolutely.
It dictates your ability to build paved roads to get agricultural goods to market before they rot. It dictates your ability to build modern hospitals and stock them with medicine, which loops right back to the lowered life expectancy issue we discussed. It dictates your ability to build a national electrical grid.
And this economic mechanism is exactly what traps them in the low-carbon, eco-friendly reality we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Right.
You cannot build a high-emission, heavy industry economy if your total economic output per person is $1,500 a year. The government cannot tax $1,500 heavily enough to fund a multi-billion-dollar power plant.
So what do?
So the citizens are burning raw biomass, wood and charcoal, for heat and cooking, because the nation cannot afford to lay electrical cables or import refined natural gas. The microscopic carbon footprint is a direct mathematical consequence of a 1,537 GNI.
It's a brutal, closed loop. Low education leads to low national income, which prevents infrastructure development, which keeps the country impoverished, which forces the next generation out of school early to survive.
Exactly.
But as complex and challenging as this national picture is, the report reveals that this $1,537 error average is actually hiding an even deeper, more profound divide within the country itself. If we want to understand Liberia, we have to split the data by gender, which takes us to pages 7 and 8.
Moving to the Gender Development Index, or GDI, is where the structural inequities really come into focus. The HDI gives us the national average, the blended score, but the GDI strips that apart to show us how those developmental achievements are distributed between men and women.
And to fully appreciate Liberia's struggle here, we first need to acknowledge the global trend, because globally, the story of women's development over the last 30 years is actually one of the most remarkable positive trends in the data.
Yes, the source data shows that the world's GDI has moved from 0.90 in 1993 to 0.955 in 2023. A score of 1.0 means perfect parity between men and women. So globally, we are getting incredibly close to equal human development. We aren't there yet, but the trajectory is undeniable.
That's amazing. What is driving that?
The primary engine driving this global parity is education. The data reveals a monumental shift that often goes underreported. Globally, women's expected years of schooling, which sits at 13.09 years, has actually surpassed men's expected years of schooling, which is 12.9 years. Across the world, getting girls into classrooms is the engine driving gender parity.
But then we look at Liberia and we see two entirely different worlds existing within the exact same borders. We see a deep historical structural inequality. Remember that average national income of $1,537. When we split it, we find that Liberian men have a GNI of $700 and $797, while Liberian women have a GNI of only $12,279.
That income gap is severe. And if we want to find the root mechanism of that income gap, we just have to look at the very engine that is driving global parity education. In Liberia, the educational engine for women is broken.
The numbers here are just staggering. Liberian men average 7.5 years of actual schooling. Still low globally, but they are getting some secondary education.
Yeah.
But Liberian women, they average only 4.66 years.
4.66 years. That means the average woman in Liberia is leaving school before she has even completed a primary education.
And that is a 40% educational penalty simply for being born female in Liberia. Think about what dropping out of 4.66 years actually means. That child is around 10 or 11 years old.
Right, right.
What happens at age 11? Puberty, the onset of menstruation. We know from global sociological data that a lack of sanitary facilities in rural schools often forces girls to stay home. We know that early marriage pressures and the demand for domestic labor fall disproportionately on young girls.
Exactly. They are pushed out of the classroom and into a lifetime of informal, unpaid, or low-wage labor. This completely explains why Liberia's GDI is ranked a dismal 176 out of 194 globally.
The data tells a biological and sociological story. But the gender gap isn't just about lost wages and lost school years. It isn't just a matter of economics. As the report's data on page 9 regarding the Gender Inequality Index, the GII, shows us, this gap is literally a matter of life, death, and political power.
The GII doesn't just look at achievements like income. It looks at the severe reproductive health risks and empowerment deficits that hold women back. Let's talk about the biological tax of being a woman in Liberia.
It is terrifying.
We have to look at the global maternal mortality ratio first to establish the baseline of risk.
Mm-hmm.
Worldwide, the average is 216 deaths per 100,000 live births. It is a tragedy every single time it happens, but medically and systemically, it is somewhat contained on a global scale.
Okay, 216 globally.
In Liberia, that number is a terrifying 652 deaths per 100,000 live births.
652. That is triple the global average. That means the sheer biological act of bringing a child into the world carries an exponentially higher risk of death.
Yes, and we have to combine that terrifying maternal mortality rate with the adolescent birth rate. Globally, there are 39 births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19. In Liberia, it is 126 births per 1,000.
Oh my God.
When you connect these two data points, the causality of the gender gap becomes devastatingly clear. A high adolescent birth rate means girls are having children while they're still children themselves.
Which immediately and permanently terminates their education.
Exactly, which perfectly explains that 4.66 years of schooling average we just discussed. It thrusts them into a fragile healthcare system with a massive maternal mortality rate. These high biological and systemic risks effectively sideline women during their most crucial developmental years.
They are pulled out of the classroom, pushed into early motherhood, subjected to extreme physical danger, and completely blocked from the formal economic sector. And that physical and economic sidelining translates directly into political sidelining on page 10.
Power follows economic participation. Because women are systemically excluded from higher education and formal economic power, their representation in the halls of power is virtually frozen. The data shows that since 2011, Liberia's female parliamentary seats have hovered around a mere 10.6%.
10.6%. Meanwhile, the global average for female parliamentary representation has risen steadily to 26.54%. So not only is Liberia far behind the global curve, but they are completely stagnant. The global average is moving forward. Liberia's female political representation is frozen in time.
This creates an incredibly important political catch-22 for the listener to consider. Imagine you're trying to fix this system. How can policies regarding maternal health or girls' education or women's economic empowerment ever be adequately addressed, legislated, and funded if the people suffering the most, the women, only hold 10% of the voting power to change the laws?
You need political power to change the system, but the system is explicitly designed to prevent you from getting the power. You can't fix the schools or the rural hospitals because you don't have the votes in parliament. And you don't have the votes in parliament because the schools and hospitals failed you when you were 11 years old.
It is infuriating.
It is an infuriating lock when you lay the mechanism out like that.
It is a systemic lock. And this concept of a systemic lock brings us to another fascinating, if grim, metric in the report on page 11, the inequality-adjusted HDI, or IHDI.
The IHDI.
We've spent the last few minutes looking at the profound inequality between men and women, but the IHDI zooms out. It measures the inequality across the broader society as a whole, looking at the gap between the rich and the poor, the urban and the rural.
I really want to use an analogy to explain the IHDI because it can sound like just another acronym. Think of a country's human development potential, like a massive funnel.
Okay, a funnel.
You pour all the national achievements, the total life expectancy, the total education, the total wealth in at the top of the funnel. In a perfectly equal society, All of that development flows straight down and reaches the citizens at the bottom.
Right, 100% flow.
But inequality acts like massive cracks in the side of that funnel. The greater the inequality, the more development leaks out before it ever reaches the average person. The IHDI measures exactly how much progress is leaking out. It acts like a development tax.
That is a very accurate visualization, and every country on Earth pays this tax to some degree, because no society is perfectly equal. Globally, the data shows that inequality swallows about 21.96% of human development. So the world loses roughly a fifth of its progress to the gap between the rich and the poor.
A 22% global leak, that's significant. But in Liberia, the numbers take another drastic turn. Their baseline HDI is 0.510. But when you adjust for inequality, it plummets to an IHDI of 0.326. That is a 36% loss rate.
Over one-third. Over one-third of Liberia's entire developmental progress is completely erased by extreme inequality.
Let's take that a step further and explain how that leak actually manifests in the real world. A leak isn't just a lost dollar on a spreadsheet.
What does it look like?
A leak is a state-of-the-art hospital built in the wealthy center of the capital city, Monrovia, that a rural farmer can't afford a bus ticket to reach, let alone pay for treatment. The national average goes up because the hospital exists. The wealth of the nation technically increased.
But the reality on the ground didn't.
Right. But that 36% loss rate proves that the rural farmer's reality doesn't change at all. It means a tiny fraction of the society is pulling the mathematical average up, while the vast majority are left far, far behind.
It proves that the distribution of progress is just as important as the progress itself. If the new secondary school requires uniform fees that only the top 10% can afford, the HDI might go up on paper, but the human reality remains utterly stagnant.
Yeah.
And to truly understand what that stagnant human reality looks like on the ground, for the bottom half of the funnel, we have to look at page 12, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI.
This is the part of the report that really strips away the macroeconomic jargon. Because usually when we talk about poverty in the global south, we define it by a strict dollar amount, living on less than $2 a day. That is the standard metric we hear on the news.
Traditional poverty is measured solely by income. But the MPI, which the report bases on extensive survey data from 2019 and 2020, argues that poverty isn't just not having money. Poverty is the actual lived experience of multiple simultaneous deprivations. It is a multidimensional assault on human dignity.
And the survey data is grim. It notes that 52.3% of Liberians live in multidimensional poverty, over half the country. So what does this actually look like? If it's not just an empty wallet, what are the specific mechanisms pulling over half the population into this state?
The MPI breaks poverty down into specific contributing factors, and in Liberia, we see a lethal trifecta. The single largest contributor to this poverty is a lack of education, accounting for 16.4% of the deprivation.
Education is number one.
Right behind that is nutrition, contributing 15.8%. And third is living standards, specifically a lack of modern infrastructure, contributing 11.1%. And the report highlights a very specific, devastating example of this: the reliance on raw biomass for cooking fuel.
Let's build on our analogies to really make this multidimensional concept stick for the listener. Traditional poverty is just looking in your wallet and seeing no money.
Right.
Multidimensional poverty is standing in a house with no roof, so you are entirely exposed to the elements. You go to the pantry, and there is absolutely no food, which covers the nutrition deficit. You try to read a manual to learn how to fix the roof, but you can't read, which is the education deficit.
Oh, wow.
And finally, you try to cook whatever meager scraps you have by lighting a fire right in the middle of your unventilated living room, which fills the house with toxic smoke, making you and your children sick. It is a compounding, inescapable environment of deprivation.
The cooking fuel example is particularly vital to understanding how poverty traps people. Relying on raw biomass, wood, charcoal, animal waste is incredibly detrimental. First, you have to gather it. Gathering wood consumes hours of the day. And who traditionally gathers the wood? Women and girls.
Right.
Those are hours stolen from a girl's day that completely prevent her from attending school.
So the cooking fuel immediately exacerbates the 4.66-year education limit we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And then, once the biomass is gathered, burning it indoors causes severe respiratory illnesses, which strains the non-existent healthcare system, which loops right back to the lower life expectancy and high maternal mortality rates. It is a perfect, vicious circle.
And this brings us right back to where we started this entire deep dive on pages 13 and 14. It is a brilliant, Terrifying full circle. That lack of modern cooking fuel, the lack of an electrical grid, the absence of heavy industry, the reliance on gathering wood, it all circles back to the planetary pressures data on the very first page of the report.
We must revisit the PHDI and look at the material footprint metric. Globally, the average person consumes 12.7 tons of materials to sustain their lifestyle.
12.7 tons.
In Liberia, the material footprint is just 1.66 tons per person.
Because they aren't consuming, they are surviving.
When we synthesize this entire 30-year deep dive, we are confronted with a brutal global reality. The world, as it currently operates, is seemingly forced to choose between two unacceptable extremes.
On one hand, you have high human development. We have high life expectancy, great schools, and thriving economies. But this model destroys the environment, causing a 10% drop in our planetary adjusted scores and driving the climate crisis.
Right, and on the other hand, you have environmental preservation, a perfectly balanced ecological footprint. But under our current global economic model, that preservation requires the devastating multidimensional poverty we see in Liberia.
That's awful.
It requires a 36% loss to inequality, 652 maternal deaths per 100,000 births, and a female population penalized with a fourth-grade education.
Let's look at the two worlds side by side, based on the Mansard comparison table from the report, just to fully absorb the scale of the disparity. Liberia's HDI is 0.510. The world's is 0.756.
Yeah.
Liberia's life expectancy is 62.16 years. The world's is 73.3 years. Liberia's GNI per capita is $1,537. The world's is $20,327.
13 times higher.
Liberia loses 36% of its progress to inequality. The world loses 21.96%. And finally, Liberia's carbon emissions are a tiny 0.14 tons per person. The world's is 4.54 tons.
It is the ultimate paradox of modern development laid bare in pure data. But, and this is crucial, the report does not leave us without hope. It does not simply present the tragedy, shrug, and walk away. The final section, page 15, offers a blueprint for the future.
We need a way out of this trap, because if the goal is for Liberia to develop to increase their life expectancy and educate their girls, we cannot have them develop by adopting the 4.54-ton carbon footprint of the rest of the world.
No, we really can't.
The planet literally cannot handle another fully industrialized fossil fuel-burning nation of that scale. So what is the alternative?
How does a country like Liberia move forward without destroying the very planetary equilibrium it currently, accidentally, maintains? The report outlines three distinct, highly targeted strategies.
Strategy number one is bridging the education gap.
Specifically, target that 4.66-year female education limit. The data is unequivocal. Education is the single most powerful lever for changing the Gender Development Index.
Really? Just education alone?
Yes. If you build sanitation facilities in rural schools and keep girls in the classroom past the primary level, you delay the age of first pregnancy. That drastically lowers the adolescent birth rate and the maternal mortality rate.
Wow, so it's all connected.
Furthermore, an educated female populace enters the formal economy, dramatically boosting the national GNI and ultimately shifting political representation away from that frozen 10.6%.
It's the domino that knocks all the other negative metrics down. If you fix the 4.66-year limit, you eventually fix the GDI, the GII, and the overall HDI, which flows perfectly into strategy number two, medical precision.
This is a call for highly targeted systemic attacks on specific health vulnerabilities. General healthcare funding is good, but the data tells us exactly where the bleeding is most severe. The focus must be on lowering the maternal mortality and adolescent birth rates.
Right.
Lowering these physical and biological risks is the prerequisite for societal participation. A woman cannot vote, work, or lead if she is fighting for her life in childbirth.
It's about securing the baseline biological safety of half the population. And that brings us to the third strategy, which I find to be the most fascinating and potentially revolutionary idea in the entire source material: leapfrog development.
This is the ultimate opportunity hidden within the paradox. For decades, the assumption has been that developing nations must follow the exact historical path of the developed world.
Burn wood, then burn coal, then burn oil, industrialize heavily, get rich, and then try to clean up the environmental mess with green tech.
But the report suggests that Liberia doesn't have to build a dirty, carbon-heavy 20th century economy to escape poverty. They have a blank slate.
Oh, that's interesting.
They can use their remarkably low material footprint, that 1.66 tons, as a baseline to pioneer a completely new, green economic growth model. They can skip the massive centralized fossil fuel grid entirely and move straight to decentralized solar and wind microgrids.
Skip the dirty phase entirely.
Exactly. They can bypass heavy polluting infrastructure and focus on digital economies and sustainable agriculture. They can leapfrog the Industrial Revolution entirely and land directly in the Sustainable Revolution.
They have the chance to write a brand new playbook for human development, one where progress isn't intrinsically linked to planetary destruction.
And that is the ultimate message of this report. Data isn't just a collection of cold, hard numbers or abstract rankings on a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
These metrics, the HDI, the PHDI, the GII, they're diagnostic tools. They show us exactly where the societal body is failing, but more importantly, they are the literal blueprints for changing millions of lives. They tell us exactly where to intervene.
It has been a heavy, complex journey through the numbers today, but a deeply necessary one. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We've looked at the trauma, the resilience, the stark inequalities, and the potential for a completely new kind of future.
Before we go, I want to leave you with a final paradigm shift. It's a thought that isn't explicitly spelled out in the report's conclusions, but it echoes loudly through every single data point we discussed today.
What's that?
For a century, developing nations have been told they need to catch up to the industrialized world. They have been viewed as lagging behind on the great timeline of progress. But when we look at the planetary pressures data, we have to admit that the highly industrialized world has actually reached an ecological dead end.
Wow. Yeah, we have.
Our path is unsustainable. So what if, with the right global investments in women, in education, and in green technology, countries like Liberia aren't actually stuck at the back of the old line? What if they are perfectly positioned to be at the very front of a brand new one?
A completely new line. That changes everything about how we view development and how we view our own responsibilities. Keep exploring these global connections. Keep looking past the surface of the statistics to find the human stories underneath. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.